You could go down, David. Everyone's in the same room. Beauty. Welcome back to the Academy. Obviously, we've been dealing with the same topic for a really, really long time. It was a good resolution. Pharmaceutical drugs, very topical, very high impact stuff, some complex information. But it's time to change it up. So now we get to talk about the exciting world of American national debt and economic growth. So I know for most of you guys who knew that this would be the topic matter, you probably are the least excited possible for this topic because it's just so dense and most of it is extremely boring. And unfortunately, because we're not even Americans, it's very difficult to argue that the information you're going to learn is going to really change your life in a significant, substantial way. But there is something really distinct about this resolution that falls under a type of category of resolutions that's very important for success in competitive debate. So because of the specific quality that this particular resolution has, I want to take the opportunity as an intro to this topic to mostly be an intro to this type of topic. This is a very large gray zone type of debate topic. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I will also give you a bit of a primer on national debt and economic growth, but first I'll give you the context of how you should be thinking about this information for the purposes of competitive debate, rather than just stressing out about how boring and dense and complicated the actual topics are. So I want to introduce you guys to this idea of thinking about the types of content or information you communicate within a debate round, within the specific structure of a 30-minute conversation that you have with one or more judges against another team. The theory I want to talk about is thinking about content in terms of 3 different categories. And you can think about that content as being like spaces on a board. You can think of it as a checkerboard or a chessboard. And as the debate progresses, you are moving that information to different spaces. You're talking about different information that works in different ways. Most checkerboards or chessboards really just have 2 different types of spaces, black spaces and white spaces. We'll talk about those first, but there's also gray space. So if I could categorize white space content, white space ideas or information you communicate, they are the flashy, obvious, intuitive things that people expect you to talk about when it comes to a different topic. So let's take, for example, for the purposes of understanding this theory, we're not going to talk about national debt. We're going to talk about something way easier to comprehend, just so we understand how the different spaces work. Let's talk about this flashy new debate topic of different schools in the United States and Canada are starting to ban designer labels in public schools. Has anyone ever heard of that idea before? Yes. So it's brand shaming, right? Has anyone else heard about that? Okay. Well, in some public schools, they're deciding that it makes certain people feel bad. It makes poor kids feel bad if rich kids can wear super fancy designer labels in school. So some schools are banning designer labels and not letting children wear clothing that flashes designer labels. Basically, it's the same type of argumentation as school uniforms, but just a slightly modified topic. So you guys can kind of intuitively understand what the pros and the cons of that topic would be. So let's think a little bit, what would be white space content for that resolution? If we understand white space content as the obvious, current events based, very approachable. What I mean by approachable, I mean that like a normal common human being would be able to relate to the topics, be able to relate to the impacts, and would have possibly a personal connection or a personal story associated with the things you're talking about. Another way to think about white space content is, let's pretend that someone was making a Netflix documentary about debating, or someone on television is in the middle of a debate tournament. You know how debate is viewed in mainstream media. If it was a TV show about this debate topic, what would those TV people be saying about this topic, right? What's like the obvious stuff that people expect you to talk about when it comes to this topic? If you could actually move one down, oh, and you move one up, Tian, or Karina, if everyone could be on the same rung, please. All right. Who wants to volunteer and participate? Who wants to give me one example of white space content? If you participate in class, then you get to move up one rung. You're doing well in class. You're advancing. If I call on you and you have nothing to say, you move down one rung until you're sitting beside Tiana and you are within spitting range of me, because I spit when I speak. So don't go down there. It's bad. Any volunteers? Please.
For that topic?
Yes, for this topic about designer labels, what would be a white space type of thing to say?
I think on the pro side, you could say like better for poor children.
Yes. So a very obvious white space discussion would be how poor people feel, or how not having designer labels would make them feel better. Very good. Could you move up one, anyone? That was excellent. Please, Chloe. Yo, sure.
Would it be like for people and like that kind of thing be like upsetting? So it would be under black space?
Not necessarily. If you upsetting has to like be actually like upsetting. Just talking about poor people's feelings might not be. There are examples of taking that white space idea, and you can definitely very easily turn it into black space territory. But we'll talk about that in a second. But what's another good example of kind of white space issues for that topic? Please, Charlie.
One could be like limits diversity.
Yeah, limits diversity. And so we won't get as much diversity of the types of things people wear. Very good, Charlie. Charlie, you also get to move up one. Very good. So if pro is talking about poor people's or poor kids' feelings, and con talks about diversity, I really think those would be good examples. Oh, for pizza. Alex, sorry. Time me out. What would be another good example of like white space thing to talk about? Please, PJ.
Violates freedom.
Yeah, sure. Freedom of expression, maybe even freedom of speech to some degree. That would be another con argument, but also very much white space territory. A person hears that argument and says, oh, okay, cool, that's an interesting argument. I expected someone to talk about that. That's probably really important to this topic. Very, very good. So BJ, you get to move up one as well. I want at least one more person to participate. If I don't get volunteers, I'll pick on you. Oh, please. Yeah, go ahead, buddy.
For con, it hurts brand name companies.
Yeah, okay. I almost don't like that because that's almost too creative. I mean, it's not. It's probably white space, but I think for most people that's like, oh, fun, creative argument. Good job thinking about the company's well-being. The problem with that as being white space territory, that it's almost too creative. It's almost less than obvious and intuitive, which is a bit of a problem with that. But it follows the criteria of everything else we've been talking about. I'll give you a point for that, so you can move up one as well, bud. Anyone else? Anyone else have any ideas? White space content for that topic? It's not a big deal. Good. I think you guys get the point. It's the obvious, intuitive stuff. If you talk about current events, if you talk about a city or a school close to you here in British Columbia that passed a certain policy or where something happened in that school, that would also be very white space. Black space is the opposite. I'm going to say that 99% of the time, you do not want to move your content and create black space content. 99% of the time. There's maybe 1% of the time where if you're a really advanced debater, it's a smart strategy to intentionally use black space content. But black space content, to a judge, to most judges, to a normal human being, when you start talking about these things, it feels very disconnected from the resolution. It feels random and out of place. It doesn't seem to tie in at all with relevancy to this topic. That's a key factor of black space content. In addition to that, usually anything that's like visual, like actually very distressing, if you want triggering, or just flat out upsetting, maybe even just gross. Maybe you just like icky. that type of content. In addition to that, it might be needlessly polarizing. That's going to be relevant, very relevant in this resolution that we're going to engage with, but it's very polarizing. What I mean by that is that people tend to have hyper strong opinions in one direction or in a totally different opposite direction. Does that make sense? Talking about Jesus Christ is a hyper-polarizing topic. If you don't need to talk about it in a topic, probably best not to. Not because the content is inherently good or inherently bad, but because people have extremely polarized views on Jesus Christ or any specific figure in religion. In general, religion is hyper-polarizing. It's not necessarily a good idea because it's possible that you need your judge to have one opinion in order to appreciate your argument, and you're really rolling the dice or flipping the coin on which way they would go. So why would you take that risk? Why would you bring up these things in a debate round if it has an extra burden, if there's extra requirements for your judge to find that persuasive? So you can understand the limitations to black space content. Now, for the sake of it, can anyone think of any examples of black space content that might be a risk on the resolution banning designer labels in public schools? Please.
Jordan Peterson states that there is always going to be a social hierarchy within any environment.
Okay.
And therefore, when you try to flatten that hierarchy, in this case, the dichotomy between designer labels and normal brand clothing, that is very bad. It's random, upsetting, and polarizing.
If you really ramp it up and you argue that social hierarchies are necessary in public schools and we shouldn't try to discourage social hierarchies, but rather we support social hierarchies in schools, that would probably get into the field of being polarizing and upsetting. Especially if you argue that, like, sometimes it's good for kids to be bullied. If you start to advocate in favor of kids being bullied for the clothes they wear, and you start talking about the benefits of bullying in school, then that's definitely black space territory. Because I mean, it's not that you can't make that argument. It's that it's a needlessly risky, bad argument to make because it's upsetting and it's very polarizing. And maybe the connection is disconnected. So that's not true. I'll give you a point for that. Here's something if you want to move up. Someone else? Please, BJ.
Schools getting lawsuits?
Not really. Not really. It's actually it's a better argument than you give it credit for. I think it's not as random as it could be to really be black space territory, and it's not really that upsetting. Like, black space is like bad, you know what I mean? It's like really problematic. So that's too good of an argument to be a black space territory. Yes?
On con, it fuels the black market of fake designer clothing.
It definitely wins points for randomness. So it doesn't feel like the black market of designer labels is the most relevant impacts in this discussion. So you get huge points for that. Huge points for that. Yes?
I don't have a set argument, but I feel like someone can link it to like racism or that kind of like oppression towards groups because people want to express themselves in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think because the topic is inherently about discrimination,
Yeah.
at least discrimination based on economic standing, it's not that crazy or random to talk about racial discrimination. So it's you got to think really far out there to really hit a black space. So that's, again, that's fine. It's good enough. But it gets points for being upsetting, right? If you talk about instances of really brutal acts of racial discrimination, then you do have that risk of getting into black territory insofar as that you're needlessly upsetting your judges and your opponents by how vivid of descriptions you have there. So there's definitely risks there, for sure. That's not an issue so much of content, but level of vividness. But I'll give you points for that, so you can move up one rung. Anyone else? Anyone else? For me, like, a black space content of this is like, mention school shootings. Why don't you just bring up school shootings in this topic? Maybe some school shooters are specifically triggered by designer labels and they want to get at all those rich kids. So they bring a gun to school and shoot up the rich kids wearing the designer labels. Feels like an unnecessary link in this debate topic. So that's kind of black space territory. Not that the argument can't be made, or maybe the argument's not even wrong. But again, you're taking extra risks there for no real reason. So that would definitely be probably black space territory. Especially if you talk about gun control at the same time. If you talk about gun control and school shootings in this topic, then it also becomes very polarizing because, again, gun control is very controversial. Yeah, what?
By banning designer labels in public schools, that would slow down the production of designer clothing, and that would slow down climate clothing.
Global warming, yes. So climate change. Sure. I'll give you a point for that. That's kind of black space because it's a lot of links that are weirdly connected, getting into a topic that seems pretty random. Like, you might be able to make that argument, but I'll give you points for being kind of close to black space territory. So you can move up one as well. Okay, I think we get a sense of good, bad topics, but it's a little bit more complex. But Joseph, go ahead if you have one.
For black space on pro, I would say like people who have these public schools go there because they're not rich enough or good enough to go to private schools. Those people shouldn't have access to these these expensive clothes.
Oh, I see. So the kids that are too poor to go to private school should be punished by not being able to wear the clothes of rich kids. Yeah, okay, that's definitely bad. Yeah, that's black space territory. Because it's very upsetting to say that the children of wealthy families should actively be punished by restricting their rights. So yeah, I'll give you a point for that. Again, that's kind of a very weird burden to take in this resolution with opinions that are very likely to not be agreed upon by your judge. Anyways, this topic really isn't about the white or the black space, but it's about the third category of the gray space. Gray spaces are the bread and butter of public forum debate, and it is critical to success. And there are many strategies you can build as a debater for your team based on understanding the debate in terms of black, white, and gray. Don't be scared of gray. Gray is where you win. Gray can defeat you in a debate tournament, but gray can easily give you an access to clear victories. Gray space is very boring, it is inaccessible, and it is usually highly technical. So what that means is with gray space, no one in the room really knows as much as you on this topic. Most judges will be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And you have the opportunity to inform them and educate them and to help them understand a specific gray idea for this topic. And then if you form your arguments using gray space, you can win because the judges don't doubt what you're saying. And you can win because your opponents can't refute you because they don't know the things you're talking about. This resolution is obviously mostly gray space. I'll talk about why in the next slide. But yeah, it's very easy to use your gray space understanding to win debates strategically. So you might open up the debate with 3 key arguments that all feel like white space, but then your rebuttal, your defense for those arguments might be highly technical, might be all gray space stuff, so that you defend your arguments and your opponents don't have enough knowledge base to ever attack those arguments again. Or you can just present your arguments right out of the gate as being very gray, very niche, and simply winning the debate by your opponents never really being able to successfully refute you. So if you use gray content intelligently, which for this topic you will need to, a judge that knows as much as you do, or maybe knows a lot more about the gray content you're talking about, will love you for being smart enough to know about the things that they know about if you present the information effectively. And they'll be like, hey, that kid understands collateralized debt obligations. What a smart kid. Cool for them. And then they'll, give you the thumbs up. And guess what? They'll be easy to convince because they know what you're talking about. It makes perfect sense to them. So when your opponents stand up and try to refute them or to refute your points with less than informed, less than effective refutation, they're just going to be like, no, that kid doesn't understand what he's saying at all. What a dumb kid. And so that's your benefit. If you communicate the gray matter very intelligently with a lot of emphasis on clarity, then even a calm judge is actually going to be pretty impressed because it's like, wow, you understand a complex idea. I didn't know anything about collateralized debt obligations before this debate round, but you taught me a lot. So thanks, Mr. Smarty Pants Professor. You win this debate round, and I'm a smarter person because of you. Thanks a lot. And then obviously, as long as your opponent's refutation doesn't feel as clear or as intuitive as your defense of your gray material, the calm judge will still feel like you're much better off. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about the actual resolution. The key thing here is that this debate is 99% gray space, which is actually kind of hard because most of the time, for example, last month's resolution, that's a pretty good example of a resolution with lots of white space and lots of clear arguments, but lots of opportunity for gray space. You can talk about the intricate details of the trial process of a pharmaceutical drug, or the corporate structure of international pharmaceutical corporations. There's a lot of room for the possibility of gray space in that topic, but there's also lots of safe white space to anchor you and to make sure that the topic stays pretty centered to key ideas. This topic is not like that. This topic has almost zero white space within it. The bridge between key ideas here is very infinitely wide, with lots of possible gray in between. So where's all this gray coming from? Well, the first question is, with the resolution about national debt versus economic growth, there's a lot of gray just in the definition or in anyone's interpretation of what we mean by economic growth. That by itself is fairly vague in terms of what it means to accomplish prioritizing economic growth. Arguably, the United States is already seeing pretty impressive economic growth. That's the status quo. So by prioritizing economic growth, do we mean continuing along the same line is what we're doing to maintain the rate or maintain the level of GDP we have now? Or does it mean to demand even more impressive economic growth? And the measurements you're using for economic growth can vary dramatically. Most debaters in this debate round won't simply use a very simple rubric like GDP or even GDP by capita. They'll probably use slightly more complex measuring tools to decide whether something counts as economic growth or not. There's a lot of gray there because there's not an authoritative body saying like, no, this is what economic growth is. There's a lot of room for gray interpretation. Same goes for prioritizing national debt. We have a lot of various opinions about what it would even mean for someone to accept the United States is prioritizing national debt. We have a national debt, so does prioritizing it mean creating a rigid structure for preventing it from getting out of control? Does it mean spending more time on legislation that prevents the debt from getting bigger? Or does it mean actively shrinking the debt? Or does it mean changing the way that we have debt? For example, in the United States, our debt, well, not our debt, American debt is owned by a wide diversity of different actors. For example, Americans own a lot of American debt in the form of social programs and not welfare, but benefit plans. So social benefit plans. Americans have a lot of obligation to future retirees. That is where a lot of the debt comes from. There's a wide gap in the American budget. But also, China owns a lot of American debt, and a bunch of other international players own American debt. So maybe restructuring who owns the debt is important when we talk about prioritization. Maybe the number doesn't even matter at all, but changing the way that we structure the debt, that's a good interpretation of prioritization. That could just be BS. That might be completely wrong, or that could be a very reasonable interpretation based off of who can most intelligently describe the gray in an inherently gray subject matter with not a lot of obvious answers. And then the big word in this resolution, which is almost intentionally mean, is the very broad word prioritize. Because there are infinite levels of definitions you guys could be using for the word prioritize. And in debates in the past, totally white space debate topics that use the word prioritize, that word itself gives you access to like a bunch of different interpretations for how the debates are structured. And a team with a good framework can manipulate that word to have a very specific perspective that blocks out a lot of what the opponent wants to talk about. So that word itself, in an already weird topic of gray space, really makes it infinitely potential. And then the last weird thing is that there's no real tension between national debt and economic growth. A lot of people think that these things are oppositional, but a lot of people also agree that they work hand in hand. That if you have a lot of good economic growth, that is a good way to deal with national debt. That by providing a certainty of economic growth for the United States, that will increase the amount of confidence people have in American goods and debt, decreasing interest rates, which is a way to decrease our national debt, or at least to manage it. So this resolution assumes that there's tension between these two ideas, but it kind of just says that there's tension between these ideas. There isn't a lot of white space evidence that we even have to choose between these two ideas. So then it's up to your imaginations to decide what this resolution even means to begin with. The team that best explains this resolution to a judge will win this resolution, and you have infinite space to decide what this topic means. As an illustration, let's pretend my whole presentation is white space. This is the scope of the resolution. There's endless space of different things you could talk about that you could intelligently argue are key to this debate. But one team might be over here talking about political issues between China and the United States, and leveraging power in our financial systems is important for political stability. And one team might be over here talking about how we're inevitably going to see a recession in the stock market and how prioritizing economic growth is the only way to prevent a recession in the United States. And they're not really linked to this topic, but they're not really not linked to this topic. It's just an issue of whether you argue it well enough and whether you have enough cards that make it seem like it's vital to the topic. So with that, I'm going to start giving you guys a lot of content on this resolution to kind of give you the basic foundation to understand the key jargon and the key concepts of it. But the most important thing I want you to understand is do not be intimidated by any specific information that you guys are forced to learn, or any specific information that your arguments or the arguments you want to make require. Because there's no necessary right or wrong answer as far as how things actually work on this resolution, because it's so broad. So your opponents very well will likely come up with ideas and economic concepts that you have no idea how they're related to this topic, and you have no idea how they actually work, but that's okay. A big part of this topic will be being prepared for that and being accepting of the fact that this debate is largely about navigating different spaces of gray space. And whoever can convince the judge and pull the debate in their direction is probably going to win. And there are some tools you can use to refute your opponent's gray space subject matter. But so be it. As far as black space information in this topic, This topic probably has the least black space, or at least it's not that much black space content, but there is some for sure. Not the blackest of taboo, bad subject matters, but there's some stuff that I would recommend staying away from. Anyways, we're going to watch this very fast-speaking video on the basics of deficits and debt, but I'm going to pause it a lot on key ideas, give you guys a chance to write stuff down, some notes, and just reiterate some stuff. At that point in time, if you guys have any questions, strongly recommend you ask them. All right.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Hill.
And I'm Jacob Clifford, and welcome to Crash Course Economics.
What's wrong with you?
Thanks. Questions?
Well, let's start a country called, I don't know, Cliffordonia. It's a pretty cool name. In its first year, the Cliffordonian government brings in $400 of tax revenue, and it spends $500 because starting a new country is kind of expensive. So in that year, the deficit is $100. Then the next year, it brings in $600 of tax revenue, but spends $800. That year's deficit is $200. So calculate Cliffordonia's debt, add up all those yearly deficits. So at the end of the second year, it has a debt of $300. $100 from the first year and $200 from the second year. Things are looking pretty tough for Cliffordonia. Not only is the nation in debt, but it also has an average tax revenue of only $500 a year. It's going to be difficult getting that space program off the ground at that rate.
Let's leave the plight of Cliffordonia behind for a moment and talk about the real world. Specifically, let's talk about the United States, since it has the largest debt. Hooray! America #1! So how big is the debt right now? 18,236,176,274,963. No wait, 18,236,176,288,000. It's hard to keep up with, but it's a little over $18 trillion. So the number sounds really, really high. I have a hard enough time wrapping my head around millions and billions, not to mention trillions. The debt seems especially high when you look at the trend over time. First, we need to adjust that trend for inflation because
Cool. So it's going to get denser, so I'll slow down a lot more. But it's important to emphasize, even that number is controversial. There's a lot of gray analysis over how you calculate the debt of a nation, because debt comes from different places, and the debt affects people in different ways, and the growth of debt is different based on those different positions. So you will have a debate where one team says the debt is $20 trillion. The other team says, no, the debt is $16 trillion. If it's a bad debate, the debaters at that point in time will yell at each other, demanding that their fact is more correct than the other team's fact. Truth is, it is subjective. Different people, very intelligent academic scholars, completely disagree about even numbers, even just the hard fact of like how much debt do we have. So that is by itself kind of a gray space content. If you have the most pleasant sounding analysis about why your number sounds, or why your number is the correct debt to calculate, then you'll probably convince your judge. But it's not that it's based in a harder truth, just a better presented truth.
dollars today are not the same as dollars in the past. Remember, we try to keep it real around here. Second, we really
All right, inflation will probably also come up. So a dollar today is not worth as much as a dollar 10 years ago. That has to do with a lot of factors, mostly supply and demand, but also the availability of capital. The more money that you print, the less valuable that money is. And it is a bad thing if you have too much inflation. Inflation for most countries is steady and consistent, but you know, that's another complex idea. Does anyone have any questions? Please.
Was it delay of capital that you said, or
Sorry?
delay of capital, where you print more money, it's less?
Oh yeah, so the idea of inflation. So one way to create just inflation is to print money. If the government prints money, that money is less valuable, and things in the market will react by being more expensive. For example, a cup of coffee today is like $4. Even 10 years ago, the idea of paying $4 for a cup of coffee would have just made some people go berserk. 50 years ago, a cup of coffee was like 5 cents. So there's two factors there. And the cup of coffee is different. You couldn't get a Starbucks Frappuccino 50 years ago. So that's one element, is that the actual products we're dealing with are different. Our perception of the value of those products are different as well. But moreover, the money itself is different. You would have been making $3 an hour back in the day. Now you have to make a minimum of $15 an hour. As a rule, things just become more expensive. For most countries, inflation just kind of happens naturally. But if it happens a lot really fast, that creates a big problem. Yeah.
Are there arguments over the definition of supply and demand? Or is that generally agreed upon?
Well, that's probably generally
Very
good. Yeah, good point. But the cause of inflation is very much debated about. And whether or not inflation is a good thing, and how much of it is a good thing, is also debatable. You could have a whole debate or a whole argument in this topic if you really wanted to, just talking about how we're calculating our debt and how inflation affects that. That's probably boring, but you could.
Should be looking at debt as a percent of GDP. Why? Well, suppose I owe 200.
So GDP is how much you can produce, your gross domestic product. It's a measurement of how quickly and how much people are buying and selling things in your country. So usually the most basic measurement for the economic strength of a country is measured in GDP, gross domestic product. It just means how much business is going on in a country, how many products people are buying and selling within a country, how much production is occurring, how much productivity, how much people are earning, as well as how much people are spending.
$100. And a 6-year-old owes $100. Which of us will have a harder time paying it off? Well, probably the
That's actually a
6
good point.
owes $100. Which of us will have a harder time paying it off? Well, probably real around here. Second, we really should be looking at debt as a percent of GDP. Why? Well, suppose I owe $200 and a 6-year-old owes $100.
Alex,
Which
I
of
need
us
your
will
PowerPoint.
have a harder time paying it off? Well, probably the 6-year-old, because even though my actual debt number is larger, I have a job. I have 2 jobs. What's your allowance, you unemployed 6-year-old? In the same way, our GDP.
That's an important point. A lot of people will argue that the American national debt is the world's biggest debt, but it's not so big a deal because the United States also has the world's largest economy. They're number 1 again, so that's nice for them. It's the fastest growing, strongest economy in the world. So when you think of the ratio of debt per GDP, it's actually not as high, or it's more competitive with other nations. Is that record over, or?
There's more.
Right here. Okay. You don't have an extension? I do though. I think my extension will actually work on yours. Right?
Should
Yeah, how Macs go. Nice. Anyone have any questions on that? There's a lot of simulations and a lot of ways to measure debt that argue that the United States has a pretty reasonable debt, actually, that it's super manageable when you compare it to the level and stability of its economy. Compared to other countries with less debt, it has a more stable economy, and it's far more likely to be able to pay off its debt. A pretty good reflection of that is that it's very cheap to buy American debt, and that Americans and the American government can borrow money for insanely low interest rates. The reason that people sell the American government money for very cheap with very low interest rates is because it's such a safe bet. It's so likely that the Americans will pay off that debt because of the growth of the stability and growth of its economy. A country with more unstable economic activity, with more variables that make it likely that it could be more volatile and less likely to pay off its debt quickly, they usually pay a higher interest rate. In order to convince lenders to give you money, they have to have a reason to lend you that money. If you're a higher risk, then they charge you a higher interest rate. And in this resolution, you have a hard time arguing the national debt is important because the interest rates are so low. Everyone knows Americans will pay off that debt. So why are we worried about our debt? We're in good standing. Everyone has faith in our economy. Our economy is growing. Don't worry about that. Let's focus on economic growth. In that sense, it's a hard time for the probe.
GDP grows every year due to population growth and productivity increases, and our ability to sustain debt grows along with our income. So here is the U.S. federal government debt as a percent of GDP. As you can see, it's risen over the past several years. So is that a bad thing?
Well, there's a couple ways to look at it. First, compare the U.S. to other developed nations. The U.S. has a higher debt to GDP than other countries, but several other countries have a much higher ratio. Some of these are in crisis, like Greece and Italy, but there are also other countries that are stable, like Japan and France, that have much higher levels of debt than the U.S. Second, most economists aren't concerned about the borrowing the U.S. has done already, because they're too worried about the borrowing they're going to do. A lot of politicians and pundits have freaked out about this, while economists are focused on this.
All right, what we need to figure out is what's driving those huge deficits in coming decades. Deficits are the difference between federal spending and revenue. So let's look at those as a percent of GDP. The problem isn't a drop off in tax revenue. What economists are worried about is spending. So let's look at where the government actually spends its money. Conservatives might complain, it's obvious, handouts. Liberals will say it's...
Does everyone understand what they mean by handouts? What's another term for handouts? Please.
Social program?
Yeah, basic social programs. So like welfare programs, subsidized housing, things to take care of your poorest. It's a very American thing to call them handouts. In most countries, we just call them social programs. But yeah, Republicans and any conservatives in the States argue that we spend way too much on that, whereas liberals on the left say that we spend way too much on the military.
Obvious defense! Well, they're both wrong. So who's the biggest recipient of federal dollars? Grandma and grandpa. The government spends about a quarter of the budget on Social Security and another quarter on healthcare programs. A lot of that.
So Social Security is very different from a welfare program. A welfare program is something you receive independent of how you've contributed to society. If you're poor, we make sure you don't die on the streets, because no one likes people dying on the streets. But a social security program is actually based off of your years of contributing directly through employment. So a portion of your income is actually taken off to put into Social Security funds, and then the interest that the government owes you from investing in your safety nets throughout the years in your Social Security deposits, that is the money that you take out. The interest is all yours once you're retired. So at the point that you retire, the government pays you a steady income based off of your years of contribution. If you retire early, like if you retire at 60 rather than 65, you receive far less money on a monthly basis than if you retire at 65, because again, you've contributed less to that fund. So we expect you and encourage you to work until you're 65, and at the end of that you get this nice cushy paycheck from your Social Security. Problem is, we're running out of that money, and no one believes we'll have enough money into those programs for like our generation. So we're definitely screwed, and that contributes to national debt in the United States as well, because they know they don't have enough money to pay for those programs. And every year, as we pay for more and more new retirees, that affects American debt as well.
That goes to retired people on Medicare. They deserve it. They worked hard. And those are the programs that are expected to grow as baby boomers retire and live longer. Defense and other discretionary programs are actually projected to shrink slightly as a percent of GDP. We'll be making another video on these specific topics later because we love making videos. But one thing's for sure. U.S. policymakers will be forced to make some hard decisions about these future unfunded liabilities.
So the answer is obviously just to keep borrowing more and more money, right? Well, not necessarily. Let's go to the thought bubble. First, to borrow, you need lenders, people who have decided to save money and loan it out rather than spend it on something else. But there's a finite amount of money that savers can lend, and most of that savings is borrowed by the private sector, which is consumers that take out car loans and businesses that pay for things like factories and computers. And when the government runs a budget deficit, it borrows from that same pool of savings. And if the government continues to borrow, many economists worry that there'll be fewer loans available for businesses, and that'll hurt the long-run growth of the economy. The second worry is the Greece scenario. A country's debt could grow so large that savers, individuals, businesses, and other governments might fear they'll never get paid back. They can stop lending money entirely, or they can lend at higher interest rates. Higher interest rates would make it harder to pay back the loans, which would likely lead to more debt, and eventually the government would simply be unable to pay its bills. That's called default, and it's basically terrible for everyone. The investors who loan the government money lose billions, and the government loses all credibility, and it causes a massive recession. That's what happened to Greece a few years ago. It's what happened to Argentina in 2001, Russia in 1998, and many other countries throughout history.
Thanks, Thought Bubble. Fortunately, the U.S. has something called the debt ceiling, which is a cap on how much debt the U.S. Treasury can issue. The U.S. will never, ever, ever be able to borrow more than the ceiling, so debt can never get out of control. No. Remember, the debt comes from repeated deficits. Deficits come from spending that's higher than revenues. The debt ceiling does nothing to cut spending or raise revenue. It just gets politicians into a big fight every few months. Basically, trying to cut the debt without raising revenue or cutting spending is like trying to lose weight by buying smaller clothes instead of with diet or exercise. It doesn't work.
Right. So they passed legislation in the United States to say that there is a cap. It's called the debt ceiling, as they say. So often every couple of years, they reach that debt ceiling and then they debate about raising that debt ceiling. And it always upsets Republicans whenever the debt ceiling is raised, and they always specifically talk about that legislation, again, because that is a piece of legislation that they actually have control over. Politicians have direct control over how much debt or how much borrowing the nation can do, but as she's emphasizing, it is a pretty superficial approach to thinking about the real issue of the debt, because it doesn't change the amount of income you're collecting, it doesn't change the amount of spending you're actually doing, so the debt ceiling is pretty artificial.
But there is good news for the U.S. First, both American and foreign lenders charge the U.S. government extremely low interest on its loans. That tells us they're confident in the government's ability to pay them back. And the low interest rates actually make it easier for the government to pay. Second, there's...
So that is kind of a key point for this debate that I want to emphasize, is that if you're going to argue that we need to focus on the national debt, you kind of have to answer the problem of why should we worry about national debt when the interest rates are so low right now? The common problem, most people, I think, that know a little bit about this topic would intuitively say that when our interest rates start going higher, that means people have less confidence in us. That could be a real problem because we have to pay more money on those interest rates. So at that point, yeah, we definitely have an actual problem. We should probably worry about national debt at that point, because that's a solvable problem. We want to make sure that we seem very credible, people have a lot of confidence in our nation. There you go. So I think on the the best strategy you have is to argue that our national debt is a problem even if lenders have a lot of confidence in our ability to pay off that debt. Just because a bank or a lender feels that America is a good investment does not mean that it's in the best interest of Americans to take on as much debt as these lenders would want. In fact, we're hurting ourselves, and then unless we prioritize our national debt, we're going to see some big problems later on, even if the banks don't think that they'll see bigger problems later on. The interest rates are, another way to think about it is that the interest rates are a reflection on how keen banks are to give you money, not on how well off you will be to receive that money, right? That's purely a calculation from the perspective of the people that are selling you money, not from the well-being of your nation. So you'll kind of have to argue outside of that.
Signs that the growth in healthcare costs could actually be slowing. Now, it's too early to tell if this is true, but if it is, the long-run budget picture will be much better than what we've shown. In fact, the projections for long-run deficits and debt have already been revised downward. Go us! So is all this debt going to destroy the American way of life? Like most things in economics and at Crash Course, the answer is complicated, and it depends a lot on what you're looking at as well as your political point of view. Looking at debt from the past or even the present is a good way to have political arguments, but it may not be a great way to think about the future. Right now, healthcare spending is driving the debt higher, but if a massive pandemic kills off half the world or there's a zombie apocalypse, after an initial spike, those healthcare costs are going to fall. And frankly, in that case, the national debt and deficit spending will be the least of our worries. On that cheery note, we've got to stop. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Thanks for watching Crash Course Knowledge. If you'd like to help keep Crash Course free for everyone forever, consider going over to Patreon. It's a voluntary subscription.
Cool. Any thoughts or questions? Is it,
So does the U.S. tend to go over the debt ceiling?
They can't. Legally, they cannot, but they often need to borrow more money, even though they've reached the ceiling. So they'll go to legislation and just say, we need to raise the ceiling. We need to increase the amount we can borrow. And then they always fight about it, and then they always pass a bill that says, yeah, we need to raise the ceiling. And then they borrow up to that ceiling again. So they're always just kicking the ball forward. And it puts up a bit of a fight, but doesn't really do much. Question. The reason why that kind of always happens is that liberals like to spend money on social programs, but Americans like to, or Republicans like to spend money on the military as well. So usually they can come to an agreement about how it's better for everyone if we have the ability to borrow more. Plus, to be fair, economics tend to be on their side, and they tend to agree with them because when compared to the GDP, the ratio is almost always pretty good. and it advocates that it is safe for us to borrow more money because the economy is doing well. So they get away with it. Does anyone have any ideas for potential black space in this topic? I know it all sounds super gray, but anyone have any black space ideas? Okay. So for this next video, I found a video clip, a news video clip from Fox News, and they're just talking about this issue. I don't think it's necessarily the most informative video, but it is a really interesting example of the use of white space, gray space, and some black space on this particular topic. So it's an examination of what this sounds like to talk about national debt and what things to watch out for. I thought this was an interesting clip. After this, my presentation's over, so I want everyone to chime in with as much as possible. So write down as much as you can that you notice as far as white space, black space, or gray space. Maybe any comments about how you felt when listening to these people talk about it, and then you get points for talking about it. If people are shy, then I'll call on you guys, and then if I call on you and you don't have anything to say, then you got to move down a space. So do your best to listen critically to a conversation from a fairly biased news source that slants it from a particular angle. But yeah, interesting to watch.
Sorry, I got good news and I got bad news, because well, markets keep climbing, and that's good. So does our national debt, and that is bad. We are now standing at $20 trillion. Yeah, trillion, with a T. Marie Bartiromo asked Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin about exactly that. Listen to what he said.
Well, let me just say, I mean, the absolute level of debt is a concern for me and a concern for the president. And as you mentioned, under the last administration, they doubled the debt. Having said that, our number one focus is economic growth. We need to get to economic growth to solve the issues that we have in this country. So the debt is a longer-term issue, not a shorter-term issue, but absolutely something that we're focused on as well.
So it sounds like getting a handle on entitlement spending and our national debt isn't a top priority right now, but as he pointed out, Trish, it had doubled over the last 8 years. So it's not as though this just happened overnight. It's been building over the last 8 years.
What do you do about it now, especially when you want to spend a lot of money? Let's go to our Fox Business All-Stars, Cheryl Casoni and David Asman. What do you think? I mean, if you were going to prioritize things right now, David, is it economic growth or dealing with debt?
It's economic growth. I think both Mnuchin and the president have it exactly right. The president, by the way, said pretty much the same thing in a Fox News interview with Bill O'Reilly. He said that there are times when you got to worry about the debt, but now we have to worry about growth. There are times when you have to prime the pump a little more, even if the well is getting kind of low, you still got to prime the pump. And this is the time to prime the pump. Yes, it's a worry. By the way, the deficit is up as well. The year-by-year deficit, for the first time in 3 years, the 2016 deficit increased by $148 billion to $587 billion. So we got to tackle spending. Spending is a big problem, and he's got a good person in the budget department to oversee that. A guy from Heritage Foundation who came out with a blueprint about how to cut the expenses. So cut the expenses of government, focus on tax reduction, and growth will take care of the rest.
The real problem, I think, is the servicing of the debt. I actually beg to differ here. I believe that the debt needs to be addressed just equally as strong as economic growth. They've got a plan for that, but they don't really have a plan for that debt. I mean, look at what at the 20 trillion number, 14.5 billion of that right now is public. Half of that is owned by foreign government. At a time where maybe our relationships with these foreign governments are maybe going to get a little.
With the low interest rates, it's not that bad.
They're not going to be low. They're not going to be low for much longer.
Look at how high they were in the early 80s. That was the same thing that people said against the Reagan tax cuts. They said, no, we got to worry about the debt. Back then, we had interest rates at 14, 15, 16%. You and I remember, the ladies don't, but it was terrible. And yet, we got the debt under control by growth back then. We did the same thing, and Reagan said, the heck with it, we're going to go with the tax cuts. I don't care about the debt. We need to prime the pump. And he turned out to be right.
Well, the bond king Jeffrey Dunlap, when he was on this program and made that first prediction that Donald Trump would win the election over a year ago now, he also made the point that Trump is a guy who's very comfortable with debt. Now, the fact that he's comfortable with debt is that he has found how to manage the cycles. But I agree with Cheryl that there will be a point when rates start to move up. If they do start to move up, that servicing the debt will become a concern. Why is it concern?
We had 18% interest rate.
The reason, David, is because at that time, there was not this idea that interest rates was such a driving impact on the overall global economy. We weren't as interlinked as we were in the 80s as we are today. I want to give you credit on something that you said at the end of the year on this program about the markets. We're now 2 months into the year, and you said the markets were going to continue to run, and I have to give you credit for that.
Absolutely.
But do you feel that the stock market has gotten ahead of itself in terms of all of these expectations being built into the market?
Well, you know, the funny thing is, people were saying during the last 4 years of the Obama administration, wow, this market is just going bonanzas. But remember where it started. Remember how badly it was hurt by the financial crisis. When you take a look at it, if you X out the financial crisis, I know it's hard to do, but you just look at where the market was before the financial crisis, and yes, it was a little overblown back then, but not too much. It's been pretty steady rise, and it had a lot more to go. It had a lot more to go, but it was stopped by those 1% growth rates all during the Obama administration. I mean, we had the most pathetic growth rate in history during the Obama administration, and even though the market was going up, the economy was pulling it down. So now that it's been released, the thing is, we have to see action on tax cuts. If we don't see action, I'm finally beginning to get, not bearish, but thinking that the market has topped out because they're waiting for action on tax cuts. If they see that delayed much longer, then the market might actually pull back a little.
Sure, you think about those 8 years, and what was the overall average? Something like 1.2%.
1.6%, I think.
It's lousy, right? I mean, we didn't even hit 2.
Yeah.
Now we have this opportunity. You get the Fed, though, however, in the background, it was helping things along back then, the only game in town, and now they actually have to do their job and raise rates at some point. So with all that in mind, can we really start to see, I don't know, 4%? 5%, dare I say 6% economic growth? Can't you see Donald Trump out there with the GDP sign saying, check this out, how much the economy is growing? I mean, what's it going to take to really start to rev the engine?
Well, I think that we're in the beginning stages of that. I certainly think that a lot of his economic plans, I believe a lot of those plans getting him elected president in the first place, are great ideas. The implementation, of course, has got to deal with Congress. That's going to be another sore subject probably for him. But 3% growth, 4% growth. If you listen to Steve Mnuchin, who was on Fox Business when he first was appointed by Donald Trump, even before he was confirmed as Treasury Secretary, he said, I am going to go for 3 to 4% growth. He wants to see that. He backed off that a little bit with Maria, I'm going to be honest with you, this week, but at the same time, long term, I think he's thinking 4%. I think he's more realistic about than a 6% growth rate. Donald Trump got for the Reagan years, as we talked about. Well, look at the Reagan years. Donald Trump doesn't want that.
1984. Remember the growth rate in 1984? 7.4%.
Yeah,
for the whole year, 7.4%.
But what was your mortgage, David? Didn't you tell me it was 16% that year?
Yeah, high mortgages.
We had that discussion.
Very high mortgages.
High interest rates with high growth is a good thing. And Cheryl and David, thanks for joining us.
High interest rates and high growth are a good thing. That's the conclusion. Okay, it's really fascinating there, because like, if you understand politics, American politics, as well as a pretty good amount of this topic, you'll understand that this space in this debate, obviously it's more slanted towards the pro in that sense, that we have this rate of growth that is pretty alarming. Double the debt during Obama years, and then a consistently growing deficit as well, year in to year end. So the trend seems to be going spiking. So that sharp spike upwards in terms of both debt and year-to-year deficits seems to be very alarming. And I think it's one of the key things that makes this resolution seems pretty important, is because that sharp spike is, like I said, alarming. And it means different things to different people. But that's pretty safe white space. The pro will argue that it's alarming and we're seeing real dangers if we don't manage that. And the con side will argue that it's a big change, but it's a necessary one that we'll be able to take care of. But that itself, that trend, is pretty good white space. So good job. I'll give you another point. You can move up. Chloe.
With like the thing about about foreign governments owning.
Yeah.
That would be like gray space.
A little bit.
Yeah, because we don't know, like, is it like half on of the growth or the deficit?
China owns a pretty sizable amount of debt. American debt. So that is kind of race baiting. It's at the very least, if you don't develop the argument well, it seems inherently xenophobic, right? Like I'm supposed to just assume it's a bad thing for the Chinese to own American debt. Without that being developed intelligently, yeah, that just seems like a weird thing to say. Potentially blackspace, for sure. But that's more an issue of how you explain it. I think in general you can make a very intelligent argument that it is dangerous for American debt to be owned by non-Americans. I think there's some sovereignty arguments in general you can make there, but directing that towards one particular foreign power seems like you would need extra justification for sure. So yeah, that's definitely black territory for sure. So good. Please move up, Chloe. Kitty?
For white, they mentioned somewhere in the 80s, like the interest rates for loans were like had 14 to 16%.
Yeah.
But that was apparently solved because of the rapid economic growth.
Yeah.
That's in Switzerland because they talked about the actual debt for like a total of 5 seconds, and then they moved on to like how economical growth would.
Yeah. As a rule, in this topic, you're going to see that debaters will just use this topic as a starting point to eventually talk about whatever they want to talk about. I argue that talking about the Reagan years it's not that relevant to this discussion, but those old dudes knew stuff about it, so they liked talking about it. And it made them seem very authoritative. That one particular guy seemed to really monopolize the space, but it was mostly only because he was talking about the Reagan years, and a contrast of now versus then. It wasn't because he necessarily had the most important things to say about our current national debt. This will happen in all of your debates, where your teams will talk about whatever they feel like talking about. The relevancy to this resolution is nebulous. It's totally up to the debaters to decide how key it really is. So that's a good point. Yeah, great. You can move up when you like. Anyone else? In general, I will say that having too aggressive of a political slant in this resolution might be a bit of a danger to you. If you are too aggressively anti-Trump in your rhetoric, or even in the implications of the way that you structure your arguments, you could run into problems for people who don't think Trump is doing that bad of a job in terms of the economy. Or at least they'll be hypercritical of you to explain to them exactly how bad Trump is doing. It goes both ways when you get into polarizing issues. A left-wing judge might be critical of you for your criticisms of Trump because they'll feel you didn't do a good enough job railing into Trump. Someone who is more sympathetic to Trump will just be critical of you because they'll feel that you didn't say enough, again, to make them feel that your criticism was believable. So you have a double-edged sword there. Arguably, it'd be best and easier just to stay away from a political slant against or in favor of Trump and just stick to kind of more neutral grounds. So that's a potentially black zone right there. But that's going to be really difficult to entirely stay away from in this resolution just because it is so relevant to obviously American policy in terms of economic growth, which is, we have a Trump administration, so that it is what it is. But be careful of it. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? So I think the specific information about mortgage rates during the Reagan years, that's super great. Like, that's nice that you knew that, and it's very specific, but it's only as useful to this resolution as you really want to make it, so. But, I mean, he used that pretty intelligently, I felt, to make himself seem smart, so that's good on him. Anyone else? I want at least one more person, so if you don't volunteer, I might call on you. One once. Twice. And one. All right, far left. Buddy, what did you notice from the video?
Cupcakes said lower Texas, just the policy prioritizing.
Okay, yeah, so in this particular video, they argue that, especially the guy in the bow tie had a very specific Republican agenda, arguing that tax cuts to the wealthiest people is going to be the most important thing that we do right now to make sure our economy is strong. He argued that the markets are waiting for the Americans to cut the tax rates for the hyper-rich, and that because they're waiting, that's somehow restricting the market. But once we make those cuts to the hyper-wealthy, then the market will be pleased and will grow exponentially. That's complete BS. That's a fabrication of how things work. But because he said that at the very end of a very long-winded analysis of gray territory, where he clearly knew more than most people on that specific information, you would assume that the last thing he said was also somewhat intelligent. Not really the case. Very biased Republican perspective to say the solution is to tax or to cut taxes for the hyper-wealthy rather than maybe reduce government spending, like reducing the amount on national defense, or even having a discussion about reducing entitlement programs for the people who retire. That's also something most people don't want to talk about because it's a very unpopular opinion. Both the left and the right do not want to talk about cutting entitlement programs for retirees because they will always lose those elections. It's probably fiscally a responsible decision, but so unpopular, it's a black territory for politicians that they come up with other solutions. But very good, awesome. All right, last notes here and then I am done, guys. Just a couple of key tips. So good debaters will make gray content feel vital to this resolution and will link it to very high impacts. If you make high impact claims at the end of your gray analysis, it seems vital to the debate and your opponents are forced to deal with your gray matter. How do you deal with someone else's gray matter? How do you refute gray matter? Basically two strategies. One is by a logical evaluation of the building blocks of how they get from point A, which is this resolution, to the nebulous, strange details of their specific claims. You have to really understand the step-by-step of how they're getting to things, and you'll have to question them during crossfires about the links that you don't fully understand. Most debaters are shy about asking point-blank questions because it makes them feel stupid for asking someone else to explain something. However, in this debate, that will be key to victory because if you don't understand the links in their gray matter, you won't be able to refute them intelligently. So just asking them how things work will give you the information you need to dismantle and fully refute their claims. Don't be shy to ask key questions in the crossfire. Most of your opponents in competitions will be shy to ask you key questions to refute you based on logic. So that's a strength of ours, so use that to your advantage. Exhaustion just means that you've researched everything about everything, which in this topic will be really hard. So I don't recommend it as your primary strategy because there's so many things that you could talk about that having a firm grasp of any of them, especially having a firmer grasp in the teams that are actually using that very specific argument in the debate, very unlikely. So just being able to logically walk through the links of an argument and figuring out the key building blocks you can take apart is your primary goal. Lastly, when you're making gray arguments, especially in this resolution, you need to focus on clarity. If your judge does not understand your gray content because they're falling asleep because you are so boring, or because you're not very logically explaining weird information that they've never heard of before, then they won't be persuaded, and then you'll lose. So you need to make sure that any gray territory you explain needs to be dealt with in a very clear and precise way. And then you'll win. Creativity is easy for our academy, but that's also going to be a key part for us here. In the tournaments you guys go to, many of your teams won't think dynamically, and they'll focus on like 2 or maybe 4 different gray areas at most. So you probably could win by exhaustion of the facts, but you will have a huge advantage by simply grasping in more creative gray zones that most of your opponents don't think about, but then again, you're able to link it into this resolution via good definition of prioritization or a dynamic understanding of how one would prioritize national debt or how one would prioritize economic growth. And then just link it to your weird stuff and then convince your judge that the weird stuff is important stuff. And then your opponents will say like, that's not what this debate is about. And you'll be like, yes it is. And then if you're a good debater, your judge will say, no, yeah it is. And then you win, and then they lose, and then that's it. So it'll be easy peasy. All right. And that is it. That's everything I have to talk about for national debt and gray zone content. Any questions? No. Okay. Cool. Well, it was a longer presentation than I thought, but hopefully helpful as well. Great. Let's take sound like 5-minute break, 10-minute break. Let's take a.
So how many of you guys understood the topic overview and kind of the main bulk of this resolution? Who would be able to give me a good TLDR? It stands for too long, don't read. It's a like an internet word for summarization. So surprising lack of things. Kristen?
Debate is really like there's a lot of gray area, as in like there's a lot of technical knowledge, and like clarity is the key to win the debates under this topic.
Good answer, but not what I was asking. Good try. Hey, Kirsten?
So federal debt comes from two places. One's intergovernmental, so they exchange debt and interest between international actors such as China and whatever. And there's private sector debt where we accumulate debt from social security, welfare programs, and like government bonds.
Yeah.
But we should work on prioritizing that on the growth side. And economic growth is the amount of production and goods. The amount of value, of goods per head in a country.
Yeah. How many people are you guys were following what Kristen was saying? Okay. So of course with this resolution it's important that you understand it. So I'm also going to be doing just a quick overview, especially because it's the morning and I kind of know you guys. I'm probably tired. So it'll be pretty relaxed. It's also a fast talking man, but there are two of them. So we'll start with the first video. Try to take notes as much as possible because I am going to quiz you guys after both videos. There will be quizzes, or there will be prizes for certain questions. Other ones don't have prizes, but we'll see how you guys do.
Good morning, Hank. It's Wednesday. We seem to have found ourselves in something of a dip.
Is that John Green again? That is. Yeah, how many of you guys know John Green? Yeah. For people who don't, he's the one who wrote The Fault in Our Stars. You could sometimes see him on Sharpie packages because he covered his face in Sharpie ones, and Sharpie decided to put that on their advertisements. So you might know him for that. I don't know why the audio is still playing from it on
Oh. Yeah, you have to plug in it's the
little thing one.
yeah.
This one. Oh, okay. I apologize in advance. He does speak pretty fast. That's why I'm going to leave captions on so that you guys can also kind of follow what he's saying.
Debt crisis, and by we I don't mean like the Vlog Brothers, I mean like the planet. I've already talked about sovereign debt problems in Europe. Today I want to talk about the purported American debt crisis. But first let me define a few terms. There are basically two kinds of debt. Unsecured debt is debt that you promise to pay back, but I have to take your word for it. And then there's collateralized debt, like a mortgage, which is debt that you promise to pay back, and if you don't pay it back, I get your house. Generally, collateralized debt is safer than unsecured debt, which is why like mortgages tend to be less expensive than credit cards, although as we have lately learned, collateralized debt is not always a good investment. Another term, gross domestic product, is a measure of like the total annual economic output of a country. In 2010, the GDP of the United States was about $14.6 trillion. That's a big number. Unfortunately, our total debt obligations are currently also $14.6 trillion. This means that our debt to GDP ratio is about 100%, which could be worse. It's not good. So traditionally when governments have a debt to GDP ratio over 90%, they tend to, I mean not always, but they tend to default on that debt, like they tend to go bankrupt. Basically the government tells its lenders, we promised we would pay you back, but we were lying, sorry, life is hard and full of disappointment, here's a Tootsie Pop. Just kidding, there are no Tootsie Pops. This is obviously a bad thing for the lenders, but it's also a bad thing for the government, because once you've proven that you're the kind of country that occasionally goes bankrupt, people are reluctant to lend you money at low interest rates. But it still happens all the time. In the last few centuries, hundreds of governments have defaulted on their debt obligations, and it doesn't matter if the currency is backed by gold or silver or promises, it doesn't matter. All sovereign debt is essentially unsecured debt. If you owe the government money by purchasing a treasury bond, they don't have a house to pay you back with, and the price of gold and silver are so far removed from their value as commodities that they don't work as currency backers either. Many countries on the gold standard have defaulted on their debt. There is only one thing backing currency in this world, and that is trust. Okay, side note, in order to help investors know whether something is credit-worthy, there are these independent, non-partisan credit rating agencies like Standard & Poor's. They rate debt from AAA on down, and generally, just like individuals, the better your credit score, the cheaper your debt. That's why Australia pays 4% for 10-year government bonds, and Greece pays 15%. Sorry, Greece. So the US is well above that 90% debt to GDP ratio that sets off alarm bells, and Congress just barely, in the stupidest game of chicken ever, managed not to default on our debt. So the rating agency Standard & Poor's was like, you know, for the first time in US history, it's time to downgrade their debt from AAA to AA+. Here's what you'd expect to happen. Our debt, being less secure, becomes much more expensive. This can be disastrous because as your debt gets more expensive, you need more money to service it, so you have to raise taxes and cut spending, which can slow the economy and decrease government revenue, and then to make up the shortfall, you have to acquire ever more expensive debt until you go bankrupt. But here's the thing, Hank, that's not what's happening in the United States. In the day since Standard & Poor's downgraded our credit rating, our debt hasn't gotten more expensive, it's gotten cheaper. In fact, Hank, the yield on some treasury bills is so low that the United States is essentially getting paid to borrow money. Why? A few reasons. First, the whole world economy is so volatile right now that even if US debt is less safe than it used to be, it still seems more safe than anything else. Two, our so-called debt crisis would almost completely be solved by just not extending the Bush tax cuts, which will happen if Congress does nothing, and as you may have noticed, Congress is awesome at doing nothing. Three, the whole world is invested in the American economy. Hank, by some estimates, half of the American money in circulation is in circulation outside the US. And lastly, at least for the time being, it's really important to countries that make stuff, like China, that countries that consume stuff, like the United States, keep consuming. So even though our debt's been downgraded, it's still much cheaper than lots of countries with AAA ratings. Hank, the fact that the dollar remains the default currency of the world and that people still trust the United States to pay its debts is worth trillions of dollars to us annually. Hank, that's probably not going to go away anytime soon, but in the long run, every time we show an inability to get things done, politically or economically, we chip away at the world's faith in us. Hank, I'll see you on Friday.
Hank is his brother. It's set up as a vlog series of them sending messages back and forth to each other, but it's also just targeted at a live audience. So I know he's speaking really fast. Were you guys able to catch the general gist of that? Yeah. Somebody from this side of the room, because you guys are a lot more quiet. Can one of you guys relay anything that you learned from that? It doesn't have to be a summarization. Literally, if you just heard one thing that was like, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting, or I understood that part. Anything?
Like the whole world invests in the U.S. economy. For example, China produces a lot so that we can consume a lot. Yeah.
Right. So it's like a cycle where they go kind of back and forth, where we'll keep making things, but you can keep buying it so that we can perpetuate our economy. Right? It's like a give and take. Symbiotic in that sense. Yeah. Anybody else? Based on how quiet it is, I'm going to assume you're not going to do very well on the quiz. But we'll see when the time comes. So there's one more video, same guy, but going a little bit more in depth.
Good morning, it's Tuesday. So one of the biggest issues in global politics.
I know you talk. Slow it down.
You should try that.
What is this?
You could slow him down and be aesthetic.
Yeah, he's just talking in like a deeper voice.
He sounds really depressed.
It's fine. Sure. See?
These days is government debt and deficit, which is a particularly big deal in the United States because of the presidential campaign and also because of the looming fiscal cliff. And hey, as you'll no doubt remember, I received a bronze medal in economics at the 1994 Alabama State Academic Decathlon, meaning that in 1994 I was the third best 17-year-old economist among all C students in the state of Alabama, so not to brag or anything, but I'm pretty qualified to explain this stuff. Okay, so first we have to separate the ideas of debt and deficit. Debt is the total amount of our outstanding liabilities. Deficit, or occasionally surplus, is the difference between what the government spends and what it takes in. Right, so in the United States, our current national debt is around $16 trillion, which sounds like a lot of money, and it is. So let's break this down. The largest single holder of U.S. government debt is actually the federal government itself, because trust funds like Social Security buy government bonds, and so the interest goes from the U.S. government to a different part of the U.S. government, which is not borrowing as we usually imagine it. So if you take away that money, you're left with about $11 trillion, which is still a fair bit of cash. Who owns that debt? China, you probably guessed. But in fact, no. The plurality of that debt is actually owned by us being American individuals and institutions. China owns about 8% of our debt, Japan 7%, and the UK 1%. But it's important to note that the U.S. also owns foreign debt, including about $235 billion of sovereign debt in China and Hong Kong. Altogether, for every $1 of U.S. debt that's owned by a foreign country, we own about 89 cents of foreign debt. So you can't really think of government debt the same way you think about like a family owing money to a credit card company, because in that situation, the family owes money to someone else. But in the case of U.S. government debt, we mostly, indirectly or directly, owe money to ourselves. So our national debt is a very large number, but at least at the moment, it is not a very large problem. Like in 2011, we paid about 3% total interest on our debt. In 2012, it will be even less because our debt is incredibly cheap right now. I mean, heck, in some ways, it is literally cheaper than free. Right now, the yield on a one-year treasury bond is 0.17%. Okay, two very important things to note about the debt. First, China can't, call in our debt on a day of its choosing. If I buy a $100 one-year treasury bond today, I'm going to get that $100 back along with my 17 cents in interest in 1 year. I can't call after a month and be like, give me my money back. So despite what you hear from a lot of political commentators, that is not really a risk to the U.S. economy. Secondly, you may have heard people say the government should be run like a business. It should never spend more than it takes in. Yeah, no, that is not how businesses are run. Like, say that tomorrow I invent a Marty McFly hovercraft skateboard. In that situation, I wouldn't wait 20 years until I'd sold enough DFTBA posters to build my Marty McFly hoverboard factory. I would just borrow the money and build the factory immediately so I could start selling hoverboards and swim in a sea of $100 bills. Actually, I would not swim in a sea of $100 bills. I would hoverboard over that sea. Businesses spend more than they bring in all the time. As well they should, and almost all economists agree that governments are similar. There are times when they need to run deficits. For instance, during a recession, government revenue goes down because wages stagnate and unemployment goes up, but government expenditures have to go up, like on unemployment benefits, for instance. So just to be clear, deficits are not inherently evil, and our current debt, while it is very large, does not pose a threat to the American economy because we can pay it back with relative ease. I mean, it's not going to be free, but it's going to be like 2% of GDP. We've done it before. However, there is a huge future risk to us, because what if our debt stopped being cheap? What if people stop believing that the U.S. is the safest place to put their money and they start to buy bonds in, I don't know, like Brazil, or China, or Germany? Well, that would be very bad, because most years we run a budget deficit, and so we would need to keep borrowing money at these higher interest rates, which would necessitate more deficits and therefore more borrowing at progressively higher interest rates. And then we'd have to cut spending, which would slow growth, and raise taxes, which would slow growth more, and then Greece. Except this might actually be much worse for us than it's been for Greece, because the U.S. enjoys all kinds of benefits from having the world's most trusted currency. Like, hey, believe it or not, most U.S. paper currency actually circulates outside the U.S., and that's very helpful for us in terms of exchange rates and keeping our debt cheap. And if we lost that, it would be devastating, because we would just be a regular country again. Okay, so the federal deficit in 2011 was about $1.3 trillion. It'll be down a little bit this year to about $1 trillion. It'll be down further in 2013, no matter who is president, to about $900 billion. But most people think that number needs to continue to come down, or at some some point we are going to risk these spiraling higher interest rates. So there are two ways of doing this. The first is to print more money, like, oh, we need $100 billion to close the deficit. Look, I just made $100 billion using a printing press. That sounds like a fine idea, except that it will lead to inflation. Now, a lot of people in comments will be saying that we should just return to the gold standard, which I think is a very bad idea for the reasons I explained in the doobly-doo. However, in the broadest sense, our currency is already pegged to goods and services, because if the amount of money in the world doubled tomorrow, the amount of stuff wouldn't. So you can imagine what would happen to the cost of everything. It would double. The second and better way to cut the deficit is to close the gap between what we take in and what we spend. And in times of economic expansion, this is actually quite easy because the tax base grows and the amount of money people make goes up, so they pay more taxes, so we can just have surpluses, as we did in the 1990s. But during slow recoveries, like the one we have right now, it is much more complicated. So like both President Obama and Governor Romney favored unspecified spending cuts, Governor Romney also favors a tax cut of 20% across the board, whereas President Obama thinks that we should increase taxes by rolling back the Bush-era tax cut on income over $250,000. Neither of these plans is likely to eliminate the deficit, although again, the deficit doesn't necessarily need to be eliminated. And no matter what political rhetoric you hear, neither of these plans is terribly radical either. President Obama wants to put the top marginal income tax rate at 39%. It was over 50% every year from 1945 until 1986. Mitt Romney wants to cut that tax rate to 28.5%, which is where it was in 1989. We can argue thoughtfully about what our policy position should be, but amid all the rhetoric and decontextualized statistics, I just want to underscore that while deficit reduction is important, it is not a crisis. The whole idea here is to keep it from becoming a crisis, and one of the best ways to do that is to understand the problem without yelling about it, to discuss things honestly without assuming that the people who disagree with you hate America. Hank, I'll see you on Friday. P.S. Friendly reminder.
No, I don't care. Yeah, so same kind of thing, except he went a little bit more in depth with his explanation this time around, hence the slightly longer video. Can somebody relay something that they learned from it? Yeah?
U.S. has competition with other countries for lenders and low interest rates.
Yeah. That was a good one. Yeah.
I have a question about like the debt getting cheaper. Is that like, can't remember like what he exactly said, but it
Or
was.
so is it just you don't understand why? Or
Yeah, like does that mean like you have to pay less, basically?
essentially, because where they pay the taxes back from come from our taxes.
And it is getting cheaper.
It's getting cheaper because you don't have to pay nearly as much. And that's the kind of idea with it, whereas more people are investing in the United States, we don't have to pay back quite as much. Right? I'm already starting to say right again. Yeah. You guys good with those videos? You guys ready for the little quiz? Pop quiz that I warned you about right at the start of the presentation. Wow. Can anyone answer either of these two questions? Yeah. Bill?
So, unsecured debt is debt that you have to pay back legally, and then collateralized debt is you lose something if you don't pay it back, like a house.
Close, but with the unsecured debt is, I want to give them a chance to explain it. So.
It's like
what do you
based
mean
on
by
trust.
legal? Yeah,
or
essentially.
interest rates.
That's what I was going to go for. Okay. What about GDP? Chloe?
The gross domestic product, and it's basically how much money you make.
Essentially, not so much as what they make, it's what they output. Yeah. Perfect. So then what's the difference between a debt and a deficit?
God.
Kevin?
Deficit's like each year how much like, the surplus of like government spending on war and like the debt is like the total amount of deficit like the country has.
Yeah, perfect. So, don't know if any of you guys caught some of these statistics or were able to really get to see the chart that he had up. To whom does the U.S. owe the most money to? And then which groups come in second or third? Yeah?
Well, the most money to is people in the United States and
Yeah, it's relatively within country. Yeah. Do you have any idea for second or third place for that?
like foreign countries like China.
Yeah. Did you catch the order?
China, Japan, no.
Yeah. About if you go by how much they owe to each group, I have it written down here. Relatively within countries, so to U.S. individuals or institutions. The second in that list is the Social Security Trust Fund. Third would be any other country that's not specified as an accumulation. But then you were right, where next, the actual countries themselves are China and Japan. Yeah. Last joke question, or Tootsie Rolls of all. Do these politicians get a nice pat on the head and like, oh, here's a Tootsie Roll for your best effort? Jiggle?
No.
Nice answer. Good. No Tootsie Rolls, but same rules. I'm going to throw it. If you don't catch it, you have to throw it back. You don't actually get to keep it. Okay? You got to trust that I can throw it.
Lauren's catching.
Ooh. Okay. So then this is open to the board, so it's a general discussion. So people who are trying to hide their being quiet or sitting in the corners of the room. What do you believe are some reasons why a reduction of the national debt is necessary? Why is this an important thing to do? Because a lot of that video, or both videos actually, seem to make it favorable on the idea that it's, yeah, kind of an issue, but it's not a crisis. It's not something that's very pressing. Yeah, Joseph? Yeah, so then what does that mean for the U.S.?
Well, it means credibility on the international scale. I mean, if we get less money, that means the reality of services national security.
You said that is high and there's more, then it crowds out private sector investment in government bonds, which harms the private sector and their ability to, and the government's ability to fund social security programs.
How the debt went down when the U.S. lost credibility, that could actually just be a reverse spike in which the debt will, interest will just rise much higher.
Yeah, so
and yeah, it's a
the
competition.
debt was not being quite as cheap. So
What?
is that the idea you're kind of going towards? That, yeah. Or,
Debt will spike up.
yeah.
It could just be north of protocol for reverses.
Yeah. So great answers from this side. Any ideas from the other side of the room? I don't want to call people, but avoiding eye contact doesn't actually help. I'm just going to throw that out there. Bruce, do you have any ideas?
So like, there will be more countries that will trust in investing.
Who will trust in investing? Or?
Shows that America will like pay back.
Yeah. So if we reduce the debt.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so that goes kind of back to the idea that Joseph was talking about, but with credibility. It starts to break. You guys are allowed to yell at me for what's doing that. So some of the arguments for pro side, I'm not going to get too in depth with a lot of arguments. We're just going to talk about two and then kind of jump into them a little bit so that you guys have something to start working on or start getting your heads around. So one of them is the idea that with the reduction of the American national debt, right, as Bruce and Joseph were talking about, if it's not reduced, then the American influence will be put into question. Their credibility will be put into question as well. Do you guys remember where this idea or concept was also talked about? What other topic that we did have this? It's kind of similar to the idea of American sovereignty from UNCLOS. When we did that, I don't know how many of you guys ran that as an argument. saw a lot of shaking hands, so guess not that many people. So with the American national influence, with how high of a debt there is, there's a lot of threat or potential to threat for future economic growth. As Josue was saying in his presentation, this topic is kind of interesting in that the two kind of go hand in hand, which is why pitting them against each other is a pretty interesting resolution. The idea of prioritizing one over the other doesn't necessarily mean that you're not thinking about the other's interests. And so with the idea of proposition side for this resolution, the idea of a threat to this economic growth is perpetuated if there are threats to what will happen with the American debt, which is currently huge. You guys have heard the estimated number throughout several videos. The reason why that wasn't one of the questions in the pop quiz is because it's different. Some of those videos are also old, but depending on where you look, you're going to find different answers. And so, with the American debt, with how big of an issue it is currently, it's not so much of an issue that you can see the daily impact of it, but you can definitely see it in certain areas where, returning to ideas like room close, the ability of the government to act on a more international or domestic scale is limited because they don't have the resources or funds to back up these measures. So a couple of the examples that I have listed there are things like being able to interfere in countries like Iran, where, of course, as some of you guys may know, or as you guys can read on the screen, I don't want to just read it back to you guys as much as possible and let you process the information on your own. They didn't have the means to really interfere or interact. They didn't have the resources to get there, and so it was left relatively untouched, which again hurts the idea of American influence or credibility. The second one with that is also in the American government's ability to support allied nations, which goes into the same idea except not with direct interference or deployment or so on and so forth. It is literally just their ability to be a financial support. Do those two examples make sense to you guys? Silence means yes. Got a thumbs up. So yeah, I could say it again and again. Most of the ideas are going to roll back to what the last little line is there. With these examples and the idea of this potential as a whole is that they don't really have means. It's more that it's a hindrance to their pursuit of these things. You guys good to move on? Should I be on the screen for a second longer?
But are they able to somewhat repay the debt so it doesn't overflow? Or is this like it will eventually overflow?
It's the threat of and the fact that it's not nearly as much as they would like, that fact that it's a hindrance. I'm going to jump to the next slide, because I only got one little response, and I think I wanted me to stay on it for a second longer. So, assuming that audience, you guys are good? Sure. Second idea, I said right here before I switched it. There wasn't even a statement with it. So another idea that is addressed in ProSci is that major reformations need to be made to budget plans, national defense spending, entitlement programs, which could be considered a little bit iffy. So there is one more video for you guys. So if you guys are writing notes about things that are on that slide, I'll go back to it.
Both Democrats and Republicans complain about America's national debt, what a looming crisis it is, and how we have to do something about it. And well, they should. The numbers defy comprehension. Currently, the debt stands at around $17 trillion, much of that coming in just the last few years. To put it simply, our government spent $17 trillion more than it took in. That's one huge deficit, wouldn't you say? How did it happen? To answer that, we have to focus on 3 programs: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Social Security is a government pension program for people over 65. Medicare is a government health insurance program for people over 65. And Medicaid is a government health assistance program for people who can't afford to buy insurance. During the administration of Lyndon Johnson. All 3 programs were greatly expanded in 1972 during the Nixon administration. And every year they gobbled up more and more of the federal budget. How much more? Just listen to these numbers from the Congressional Budget Office. In 1970, these 3 programs accounted for 21% of all federal spending. By 2012, they accounted for 42% of all federal spending. And now, we've added a 4th new federal assistance program, the Affordable Care Act of 2010, otherwise known as Obamacare. Just to give you one example, Medicare Part B, the part of Medicare that covers doctor services, was originally projected to cost $500 million a year. In 2012, it cost $164 billion. Whatever you think about the value of these programs, how are we going to pay for them? The Congressional Budget Office projects that before today's 25-year-olds are ready to receive Medicare, these 4 programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the Affordable Care Act, are expected to cost more than all the money the government collects in taxes. That would mean we would have to borrow money to pay for everything else. Our armed forces, road repair, everything. So what do? Well, we could increase taxes, massively. But to raise the kind of money we'd need, we'd have to significantly increase taxes on everybody, especially the middle class. That means taking a lot more money out of your paycheck and mine. Because if you think we could get what we need from the rich, think again. If we took all the earnings of people who make more than $1 million, a 100% income tax, that would only net us a little more than $600 billion. And obviously, we could only do that once. The second answer, and much more practical one, is to cut spending. Specifically, cut the rate of growth of the 3 legacy programs: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. That doesn't mean spending less money than we already are. It simply means not increasing our spending as fast as we have been. Social Security would be a good place to start. In 1940, the average life expectancy of an individual in the United States was less than 65, the age at which people begin to get Social Security. Today, average life expectancy in the U.S. is almost 80. Obviously, it's time to move the age at which Americans receive Social Security to reflect our longer lifespan. There are a lot of common sense reform ideas out there, but if we don't enact a few of them soon, we're just going to continue to watch the debt grow bigger and bigger. This issue, controlling spending, should be of intense interest to everyone, but especially Americans under 30. If we go on spending much more than we take in, they're the ones who are going to be left holding the bag. So the next time a politician proposes a generous new government benefits program, the first question should be, where is the money going to come from to pay for it? And if he or she is honest, there's only one answer: from you. I'm Michael Tanner of the Cato Institute for Prager University.
So this guy is not speaking nearly as fast, so hopefully easier to understand. Were you guys following what was going on in the video? It's the same thing. Can someone relate something that they heard or picked up? Hopefully, I'm going to keep pointing to the side of the room. So let me ask that you point to the team and I'll stop looking over this side.
Cost of the three programs though, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid doubled in 42 years. Because it started in 1970 and in 2012 it was 42%.
So someone took one from me. Someone move towards the center. Just see if I see any raised hands. Anybody else? Not this side of the room. That's cool. So, right at the top here, there's an actual definition for you guys on what an entitlement program means as part of this contention or this idea. So considering that the definition is right up on the board for you guys, can somebody re-explain what that means to me in their own words? Should I call on someone? Kayla?
So like tackling those three different services, which is social services, Medicare, and Medicaid, by just making sure that we don't spend any more than those are already taking up, and then or cutting them down in some way. That would be the reformation.
So you already gave me the examples of the entitlement programs. Did you guys you guys can see it up on the board right now for what the difference between a contributory and non-contributory means? Are all of those contributory or are they non-contributory? Can you categorize them for me?
Are they non-contributory? Yeah, non-contributory because they're like social programs.
No.
Like I think only Social Security is contributory, right? Because you have to like put money into it to get money out of it.
Yeah, but there's more than one program that had money going into it. Oh,
Medicaid, with the one for people 65.
Yeah, just Medicaid or?
Medicaid and social services because they included the taxes, the government or together.
Yeah, perfect. Same thing. You're gonna have to trust in my ability to say listen. If you don't catch it, you have to toss it back. And somebody else gets a shot at it. I didn't know the questions. Whenever I say that, it's mostly a joke. Mostly. Depends on how good of a mood I'm in.
Yeah, more. Yeah,
No, let me answer.
Put your hand up. There hasn't been a question asked. Now there's going to be a question asked. You can see it in the red. What is the impact or the purpose of these reformations?
Like what? Like, oh.
Oh, I know like Christian.
So I assume these
Are to minimize the use of spending of the legacy programs. The impact, the purpose of it is to keep the federal debt from increasing and minimize the increase of federal debt. And the impact of that is, or on the flip side, it's going to increase the amount of people who receive social welfare. That's going to be bad. People are going to die. Yeah. But that
We're working on side proposition.
what? Wait, what do they mean by reformation?
So reformation is like a new definition, so it means refining the program. So like the example that the man gave in the video, where as times have been changing, that means that these things that are slightly outdated need to be updated.
So the purpose of it is because if you look at like life expectancy from 50 years ago to now, it's increased. It used to be 60, like the fuel liquids at 80 social welfare far longer than they have in the past. And that is a huge burden on the economy because we're spending more money into the individual than we need to, and that is blowing up federal debt. And so the reformation that he's proposing is that we increase the amount, we increase the age in where people are eligible for social welfare, and that is going to help cut down costs.
So essentially the idea of that argument, and you did a good job of explaining it, is that a lot of these burdens, such as the rate at which the debt is increasing, are essentially avoidable. There are solutions. And so the fact that a lot of these get kind of skimmed over or not implemented is a big issue. Yeah, so you do get one for that. Same thing though. This one I'm going to be a little bit stricter with you on. If you don't catch it, you can throw it back. I saw both Caleb and Jay who put their hands up as well. They also heard your answer. You ready?
Don't mess this up.
So people on this side of the room, were you guys able to kind of hear Crispin's? Do you know that? I don't know what just the slight raise of the chin means. Was that a kind of? Kind of? Okay. It was basically just a recap of what was going on in the video and some of the explanations that he gave, with the addition of my rewording, if you heard that part. Yeah? All good, you guys? Yeah, so that's the end of my presentation on that. It was just starting to get into some ideas so that you guys have ideas to start getting your heads around. You guys good with these two? You guys good with the resolution? The fact that I didn't see anybody nod is a little bit concerning. Okay, cool. Thanks, Tony. Yeah. Should we save this for?
Alright, so we're going to do the con side now. So just to start with a quick overview. How much debt does the US have currently? It's about 22 trillion. Fun part is you can actually go to this website.
We've removed more TV, so you can enjoy TV more. Even when it's off. Introducing the
President Donald Trump has made no secret of the fact that he thinks that the economy and the stock market would be in big trouble without him.
I'll tell you what, if I ever got impeached, I think the market would crash. I think everybody would be very poor.
It's an argument that keeps coming up and will probably come up more. Whatever you think of his policies, whatever you think of all the scandals and the tweets and everything else that's gone on in his administration, the economy is doing great. And the question is, how much credit does he deserve for it? On the headline numbers, the economy has been strong, no doubt about it. Trump has overseen 6 consecutive quarters of economic growth that's not only been positive, but also been above trend. We've also seen big gains in corporate earnings, and the stock market, which is now the longest bull market on record, has continued while he's been president. Look at confidence levels. Consumer confidence is at its highest level since 2004. The National Federation of Independent Business Index, which measures sentiment for small business owners, is at its second highest level ever. And that went up as soon as Trump got into office, Some of the other metrics, a little bit of a mixed bag. Hiring has slowed somewhat, but that would be expected with the economy where it is right now. In June, there were actually more job openings than there were people who were classified as unemployed.
Which, as scary as that is probably true. All right, so let's talk about where the U.S. government generates revenue from. Any ideas? Where does the government get money?
Taxes.
Taxes? Okay, what kind of taxes? There are different types. Any idea?
Corporate tax.
Okay, there are corporate taxes. Yeah, there are income taxes. We have individual income taxes. Yeah, we also have like social insurance payroll, corporate taxes, all these kind of things. So these are all the main sources that the U.S. government is getting their money from. If you look at this graph, it actually breaks it down, the revenue in 2016. So as you can see, about half of government revenue comes from individual taxes, about 9.2% from corporate taxes, everything else is up there as well. But then what do they spend that money on? Well, there's a bunch of things. They have obviously like Social Security, Medicare, health, military, their interest on their debt, education, everything. There's a ton of things which the government has to spend their money on, and a lot of that is using debt to finance these things. So this is a little bit of a breakdown in terms of how they spend it. They have two kind of different budgets, which is their mandatory budget and which is their discretionary budget. Their mandatory budget would be things they have to spend on. You basically have no choice. That'd be like funding pensions or kind of healthcare, those sort of things. And the discretionary is things like how much we spend on the military, for example. In terms of we don't have to necessarily spend it, but we do. For an even better breakdown, you can see this graph. Breaks it down in terms of the actual individual percentages of what they spend on and what they don't. As you can see, as we mentioned before, like Social Security, unemployment, labor is a big one, as well as Medicare and healthcare. You can see like a discretionary spending more along the military lines is at about 16% of total spending. And that's actually gone up in recent years as well. So next we're going to watch this video. It talks about why we should stop worrying about the U.S. debt, and then we're going to have a quick discussion on it.
Hi, I'm Brian Levitt, and this is the truth about U.S. debt. The U.S. government now owes $20 trillion. $20 trillion! It's unimaginable. You hear scary observations like if you took single dollar bills and stacked them, you would get to the planet Uranus by the time you reach 20 trillion. Again, that's unimaginable. And what we show you on this chart is that that 20 trillion has built up over many, many years and across many generations and across many administrations to the point where it's now $20 trillion, a level that actually exceeds the total gross domestic product of the U.S. economy. Now, many investors believe that because we owe $20 trillion in debt and because the debt is likely to grow over time, that something is going to happen or an event will occur that will cause a collapse in financial markets, a collapse in the U.S. economy, or maybe even a collapse in the American empire. The reality is anything but the case. In the following slides, I'm going to talk you through a couple of concepts. First, should we really be comparing U.S. debt to GDP? Let's talk about the assets and taxing power of the United States. Second, a lot of the U.S. debt is actually owed to ourselves, and we'll talk about that. And finally, this idea of unfunded liabilities, this $100 trillion of unfunded liabilities, is really not as scary as some would have you believe. So let's start with a simple balance sheet, right? We know, we talked about it, the liabilities of the federal government are $20 trillion. And when you compare that to the total output of the country, the gross domestic product, the liabilities are greater. But think about when you borrow money. When a bank seeks to lend you money, are they looking at what you produce every year? No. They look at the assets against which you are borrowing. And what are the assets of the federal government? And how large are those assets? We estimate that the assets of the U.S. government are somewhere between
Just to be clear, before he goes on, an asset is simply something that you own. So for example, like if I go to get a mortgage or get a loan, like I may use my house if I own one, for example. And like you can borrow money based on what you own versus like the money you're making. That's essentially what you're
$100 and $300 trillion. It sort of makes that $20 trillion in obligations seem small by comparison. So what are the assets? How about 47% of the land in the West, including almost all of Oregon, Utah, Nevada, some of the Gulf Coast of Florida, some of the most pristine land in the world, right? What's that all worth? I don't know, but a significant amount. What about all the commodities underneath the United States? It's estimated that the U.S. is sitting on top of over $100 trillion in oil, over $8 trillion in natural gas, over $22 trillion of coal, all the property that the federal government owns, the gold that the federal government owns. And what about the future taxing power? Over long periods of time, the U.S. has grown at 5% nominal. What if we only grow at 4% nominal for the next 50 years? A $20 trillion economy today will be an over $130 trillion economy by 2050. That's a lot of revenue that we can generate in taxes. The second point is around who owns the federal debt. 27% of the federal debt is actually owned by the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve, the Social Security Trust Fund. This is money that the U.S. government owes to itself. What about the rest of it? The rest of it is held by savers like you and I, by financial institutions, insurance companies, and about 40% is held by foreigners. The Chinese, the Japanese, the Brits, or anybody else looking to generate income off of the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. Now, some people look at that 40% number and say that's frightening. We're borrowing from our neighbors. What happens if our neighbors do not want to lend us money? I guess the first question to ask is, why wouldn't they want to lend us money? Why would they start to doubt the full faith and credit of the U.S. government? And the second thing to realize is that for all this concern about China, so what happens when China begins reducing their exposure to U.S. treasuries? Well, guess what? It's already been happening. Chinese ownership of U.S. debt peaked at $1.3 trillion a couple of years ago and is now about $1 trillion. And guess what? The borrowing costs of the U.S. government have actually declined throughout that time period. And finally, we talk about all these unfunded liabilities of the U.S. government. $50 trillion, $70 trillion, $100 trillion of unfunded liabilities. The first point to make is the $20 trillion is our debt. The $100 trillion are promises made to future retirees. Now, what we do to address those promises will determine the solvency of the federal government going forward. The nice thing is we have options. We talk about Social Security. We talk about Medicare. It's not as if we sit here and our politicians can't change what we provide to future retirees or change how we generate revenue to provide benefits to future retirees. We show an example here in Social Security, and we remind people that in order to address the problems of Social Security, we could eliminate the taxable maximum today. And we'll go a long way towards fixing the solvency of Social Security for decades to come. Or we could do a combination of measures. Things like raising the payroll tax, not by a substantial margin, increasing the retirement age, changing the cost of living adjustment. Again, we have options, and we don't have to just sit here and wait for these $100 trillion of unfunded liabilities to collapse the U.S. government. So in conclusion, $20 trillion may sound like a scary number. And when you compare it to the total output of goods and services produced by the United States, it does represent greater than 100% of total GDP. But the reality is, when you think about the United States and all the assets that the federal government holds, the U.S. continues to be a very good borrower and a very good credit risk, And there's a reason why US borrowing costs continue to remain at very low levels. Thank you.
All right, so that kind of gives like a bit of a picture in terms of downplaying some of the risks. So again, just to quickly explain like how that debt-asset relationship kind of works that he's talking about, you can usually borrow against the assets you hold or like what you own, and so the more of it, the more you can borrow against. So in this sense, basically the United States has arguably more assets than any other country in the world. So by that standard, their debt really isn't that high. All right, we're going to take a look at a few ideas. I've kind of prepared 3 of them. So first is like, why is not the right time? So why not right now? Or why is this not the issue we should worry about at this current time? First off, we need to look at something called the yield curve. This is how much it costs the United States essentially to lend or to borrow money, or how much if I lend the US government money that I would get back in terms of an interest rate. So essentially, if I loan, or if the US government wants to borrow money for 1 month, they'd be paying around 2.3% interest per annually, which means that arguably, like let's say the US government needs to borrow $100, at the end of 1 month, they pay you back $100 plus about, if it's 1 month, that would be 20 cents, about 20 cents. So I'm the US government, I borrow $100 from you, at the end of 1 month, I'll pay you back the $100 that I originally took from you, and in return for you loaning me the money, I'll pay you back 20 cents. I guess, yeah. All right, as you can see though, the longer you lend the money out, the higher as the US government I would have to pay you to do that. Any ideas as why that would be the case? So if I borrow money on a longer term, I have to pay a higher interest rate. Or I have to pay you more back to reward you for lending to me. Kristen? Okay, to account for inflation, that's part of it. Remember, the return is annually. So like, inflation is about 2%. So regardless, I'm paying you more interest each year than the inflation rate would be. But partial interest. Not the primary reason. The primary reason is the longer that you lend out the money, the more risk I'm taking on. Because I don't know what, like, in 1 month, I probably know what's going to happen. Or like, fairly soon, right? The United States is not going to blow up as a country in 1 month. But what's going to happen 30 years from now? I have no idea. So the reason that this happens is to reward you for taking more risk in the long term. Now, how demand are US bonds, or bonds are code essentially for debt, how in demand are they? At this point, they are so in demand that if I lend money, the lenders are willing to pay more money than those are currently worth. So for example, if I want to buy a 10-year government bond, so I want to lend the United States my money for 10 years, and I want to loan them $100, I would actually have to pay $101.17 to buy that, to buy the right for them to give me $100 10 years from now, plus all the interest and everything else. What that means essentially there is actually more demand for these bonds than there is supply of them. Which means there's a greater number of people willing to lend money to the US than the US has money to, or than the US has a desire to borrow. The other key thing to note is how low are the inflation rates. This goes all the way back to 3000 BC. And as you can see, where we are right now is close to about the lowest ever. In fact, the lowest ever was, I believe, around 2012, 2013. That was arguably, or some historians would say it's the lowest interest rate in history. So the point is it's very, very cheap for a government like the United States to borrow money. Now, or like throughout the history of time, as this graph would illustrate. We don't have time to go over this one, so I'm skipping this. Yeah, I'm just going to skip these. So, why prioritize now? A few reasons. First off, like companies need money to borrow to do business, and it kind of follows in principle with if the government can borrow money at a cheaper rate, so can companies. Which means it's a better business environment for companies to conduct business, because if I need to go, say, buy a new factory, and I need to borrow money to do that, I can get it at a lower interest rate than I could if interest rates were higher. Also, you can argue that the growing revenue from this is going to actually solve the debt problem and at the same time grow the economy. Because assuming the economy grows faster than the debt grows, you would generate more money in revenue than you actually be to be paying off that debt. The second idea is innovation. So first off, like just an open question, what kind of things or what conditions would you say foster innovation? Any idea? Two.
Like capital investments.
Okay, capital investments, yeah, so the ability to get money, yeah, that's important. What else? Any other things? There are many things that companies want.
Competition or like that ability to like compete with other people?
Compete? Not necessarily. Sometimes they say, I want less competition, I can make more money. Other things, other factors? Alright, well I have 5 of them here, which is they want a skilled workforce. If your company's going to do well, you need employees who know what they're doing. You don't want to set up, say, a tech startup in a country that has nobody or has very little of the population who knows how to code, for example. That wouldn't make sense. You also need access to capital or money. It's like you need to be able to borrow money or to go get money somewhere. You need a consumer market with a large amount of disposable income, meaning just like you have consumers who can go buy things, right? So I work my job and I made $100, and I have to also pay tax, so I paid $50 in tax, let's say. So I have $50 left, and then I can go spend that money. They want people who have a lot of that money to spend. Fourth, they want other businesses willing to buy their products, because there's not only consumers buying your products, there's other businesses. And then last, they probably want low tax rates, because that means that they're going to pay less than the money they make. So if I make $100 instead of paying $40 in tax, if I pay $20 in tax, I can make an extra $20 for doing nothing. So these were for larger companies. What do you think that smaller businesses would want in their environment?
Can you go back to
to this slide?
Yes.
Sure. What do smaller businesses want then? You?
Low taxes.
Low taxes. Okay, good. What else? Okay, because we're running out of time, trick question, they want exactly the same things. So, oops, wow, how do you get ahead of myself? Okay, summary of that point, just quickly, is that all business actors have relatively the same needs, and most of them comes down to a strong economy. And when the economy of the countries they're based in do well, those companies tend to do well. And that's good not only for the people working for those companies, it's good to help bring more people into your country, and it's beneficial in terms of you can now have more revenue to raise, which is more things for those governments to spend on. Getting to the last point, strategic interest, this is kind of the third idea. So how closely are power and economic output linked? This is the gross domestic product of both at the top of the list and at the bottom of the list. And as you can tell, the countries at the top, most of them are doing pretty well. I'd say the United States is doing well, China's doing well, Japan, Germany, United Kingdom. Versus those at the bottom, Tuvalu, most of you probably never heard of that country. The point is, those at the top of the list, you'd probably say have more power on the global stage, just generally. I don't think anyone's going to argue that, You can get Tuvalu to overpower the United States, for example. Probably not going to happen. The point of this is strategic interests and a strong economy are very easily linked on a few ways. First, without the US prioritizing their economy, their growth might be too slow to be competitive with those other countries. All right, I know that was very fast, just because we're running a bit low on time. So does anyone have any questions right now? If not, feel free to come ask me during lunch break or whatever. Any questions? Oh, Julia.
You know how to buy U.S. bonds? That's like the first idea. Like they pay like $1.17 more or whatever.
Yep.
Percentage more. Why do they want to buy a bond? U.S. bond though.
So a few reasons. First, U.S. bonds are considered the safest grade of investment possible, given that the U.S. has never defaulted in the history of the country. They're one of the few countries to have not defaulted, as well as they have the ability to tax the wealthiest population. Because of those two general factors, they're considered the safest versus any other country. Oh, the third factor is liquidity of bonds, which means that more people buy the bonds, there's more trading of bonds. So I need to sell them. It's very easy to sell a U.S. bond, which if I buy some bond that nobody really wants to buy, I can't sell it when I need to. So because of those three factors, it makes U.S. bonds the safest and the most convenient to trade for generally investors or countries who have a very low risk profile, because it's basically guaranteed money. It's the closest to guaranteed returns that you can get in any investment possible, basically. So I guess there's just an abundance of people who want that at this moment in time, which would get into market cycles and all that, which we don't have time for. Any other questions? Kristen?
When you invest in government bonds, do you invest in government bonds, or like what specific things do you invest in as a government bond?
Basically, you're just buying the debt. So you are paying a certain amount of money to buy the right for them to pay you back what you paid them in the first place and an interest payment over time. So as I said, I put up the interest payment. So even right now, you can see the yield is the interest payment. So they'll pay you that. It's semi-annually on government bonds. So if I loan the U.S. government $100, for example, and I do it on a 10-year basis, I have to pay them $101.17 for that, of which I get 2.99% of what I loaned them each year. So if I take that annually, that would be basically every 6 months, I would be getting $1.50. And so you earn the right to get that every 6 months, and at the end, you earn back everything you paid in the first place, plus the final interest payment. Anything else? Any other questions? No? Okay. Again, if you guys have further questions, we did go through this fast, do find me during the break. If not, I believe Jenny is going to be playing a game with you guys, so good luck. You need the other adapters up. This for USB-C. By the way, do you have the other adapter? This one's for USB-C.
Where's it?
Is it? Oh, okay. Never mind.
Okay, I'm going to do a couple of things before. So I'm going to be talking about, briefly about the upcoming tournaments. And then we will do a short Kahoot if we have time. But sheet of which tournaments are coming up. But the first one with Puget Sound and PLU, these two tournaments are probably going to be the bigger ones that you guys are trying to focus on. This one is with this topic. So with the debt topic for this month, it would be with the PLU and Puget Sound. The reason why I am putting the Puget Sound and PLU on there is because it's quite popular, and it is a university tournament, both of them. So that's why a lot of students that are kind of hesitant of going to more bigger tournaments in the US, they like to go Berkeley. They would go, and I would recommend going to Puget Sound and PLU before you guys
get a try on the major tournaments. So we don't really have a limit of how many people we're going to send Puget Sound and PLU, but it is a very popular tournament, so if you'd like to go, just please contact me beforehand. It's those tournaments where we take the big bus because there's so many people going, but it's very less likely that you won't be able to go, but just tell me just in case if you would, okay? So now, Berkeley, Harvard, Stanford, UPenn. So the mini debate that you guys did last week, that was kind of like the evaluation form on which we can kind of make a cut line on how many people can go or not. So we're not going to have like a set tryout for any of these tournaments since the last week's mini debate was a tryout. Okay, so I do have all the ranks and all that from 1 to 60. I didn't post that to you guys because you guys can, I think you don't really need to know the entire unless I talk to you. So for Berkeley is 7 teams. That's not including varsity teams. So we already have a set varsity team, so it's just 7 teams that I'm looking for. So 14 people. And then Harvard, Stanford, UPenn, we didn't get really a set amount of teams, how many we're going to send, but it's around 5 teams. It can extend, it can be lower, but that's basically it. I will be either contacting you or I brought some people out to the front to speak to them, so that might be the case. But by tonight, I will be sending in the set Berkeley teams so we can start the workshop. Yeah. People that are like, I don't know which university I want to go to, I would recommend Stanford if that's going to be a tournament that you want to do well with. Stanford would be a good start of a university tournament. The thing with last week's mini debate results was kind of unexpected of what I thought is because basically 1 to 14th is if they all wanted to go to Berkeley, they would go. But a lot of non-experienced students also got in the top 14. So some of them, I would have to speak to them if they would like to go to other tournaments, but I know Berkeley is one of the most popular. So I will contact you, or you guys can come see me first if you guys have any thoughts. Yes?
When's the workshop?
It says on all the sheet, I'm pretty sure David already sent it to you, but it's, oh yeah, I remember. It's December 27th to 29th.
What if you choose the wrong topic?
Oh, don't worry, we won't. It's usually we have connections on knowing like which topic is most likely to be it. But yeah, the Berkeley, all of these tournaments won't be with this topic. Okay? But the workshop you guys will be prepared with the set topic. Cool. Any questions? And of course there's also other tournaments other than like the big tournaments. So cool? Okay. Everyone get Kahoot out. Go to kahoot.com, I think. Yeah.
Are all those tournaments before like March, or are we going to, or are they like throughout the year? They're not throughout. Like all the university tournaments.
They are.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.